and high inflation, something the world hasn't really seen or have had to grapple with since the 1970s. Now it's back in the aftermath of a severe global recession induced by COVID-19, of course. The latest global economic prospects from the World Bank projects the global growth for 2022 to be under 3% globally, which is almost half of what we saw in 2021. So that optimistic story of recovery and resurgence has now been dampened. We all know why. Energy and food prices, trade disruptions, and supply bottlenecks largely triggered by the war in Ukraine, and the interest rate normalization that we're seeing right now in the developed world. So the World Bank projects that the real income per capita in 2023, 1 year on, will remain below pre-COVID-19 levels in about 40% of developing economies. And the sharp contraction in growth that has been projected is actually was massively revised just from last January. So big change just over the last few months, largely due to the war. Now, there are some parallels to the 1970s. The interest rate hikes that induced a global, that touched off a global recession might be back. And this is something that we need to respond to. And that triggered a lot of the debt crises in developing countries in the 70s. And this is what we're beginning to see. In the 70s, we saw a whole lost decade, especially in Latin America. Then this is what economists are now worrying about, might be triggered in the post-pandemic development. External public debt is hugely owed to private creditors, and the interest rates are, because they are variable, can spike suddenly, right? So these are all factors that are sort of similar to the 1970s, but unlike the 70s, the World Bank makes this point also that the dollar remains strong. The oil prices that quadrupled in 1973 and 1974 and doubled again in 1979, 1980. That's not the situation we're in right now. In fact, when adjusted for inflation, oil prices are only about 2/3 of what they were in 1980. The balance sheets of many financial institutions are generally strong, and economies are much more flexible in terms of the labor market adjustments, etc. And the monetary policy frameworks are, we've learned a lot over the last 50 years. So these frameworks that we deal with, that policymakers deal with, are much more credible, and long-term inflation expectations are also better anchored. And existing technology and capital can also respond to some of these supply disruptions to hold down prices. So there are some parallels, but there are some distinctive differences as well. So the three key issues on the global front is how to counter the spike in oil and food responses. This is country by country, region by region, we would have to address it differently. Debt relief that is comprehensive and that is substantial. I think that has to be a big agenda in the next few years. And the health pandemic isn't over yet, right? So the health preparedness, the expansion of vaccines, vaccinations, the universal coverage, etc., remains important. And together with that, on the positive side, some opportunities for action to take on climate change, etc. Let me now turn to the case from Sri Lanka, where I was a few weeks ago. And there are some parallels with Pakistan here, but I'm not going to preach on Pakistan. The August audience today, the gathering there, will deliberate on the matter. But I believe some of the issues that Sri Lanka is grappling with might be of relevance to as you hold discussions on the Pakistan events as well. Now, the crisis in Sri Lanka is somewhat unique in the sense that it's a massive external debt overhang, but it's a combination. It's a combination of both the liquidity crisis and a solvency crisis, right? So it's in that regard, it's a twin crisis. And it is often challenging in macroeconomics when you deal with a twin crisis of this nature, because you have to replenish foreign exchange reserves to maintain import flows, but that has to go hand in hand with a rather difficult task of achieving debt sustainability. Sri Lanka is only the third country to default on sovereign debt in the post-pandemic era, besides Zambia and Lebanon. And the obvious triggers there were obviously the slowdown in remittance inflows, the collapse in tourism in the aftermath of the 2019 Easter Day bombings, which is a year ahead of the onset of the COVID pandemic, and the stagnated export performance there. I think there were 5 major policy blunders, if I may call that, that preceded the sharp and unpredictable deterioration in the Sri Lankan circumstances. The first is what people have recognized, not just in Sri Lanka, but in countries like Laos, PDR, possibly in Pakistan, elsewhere. This debt-fueled infrastructure boom, when it doesn't result, it may result in internal economic growth, but doesn't result in that tradable surplus where you are bringing in hard dollars to service all that amount of debt that you're accumulating to fuel that infrastructure in the first place. So that sort of a paradoxical situation is what we see in Sri Lanka in quite clear terms. After the Tamil insurgency was crushed around 2009, the leaders at the time, President Rajapaksa and others, felt that they had to make up for lost decades, catch up in development terms rapidly. That's when they got their country rated, started borrowing in the international markets from private creditors, augmented lending and borrowing from the international financial institutions, and also new players such as China as well as India. That jet-fueled infrastructure boom is obvious. One can see it. I lived in Sri Lanka for a while, 2005, 2006, before this crisis, and when I visited the country recently, you could see that. It's very conspicuous, it's visible, it's massive. But what one notices now is perhaps not all of that led to this generation of a tradable surplus. And over the later years, obviously, as this infrastructure boom continued, a lot of that was also dictated. The project choices, the project selection methods were often dictated by cronyism and misplaced political priorities rather than the merits of the case. And we've heard about the Hambantota case, the port having been leased to a company overseas when we're not able to service the debt. But at the same time, there's another infamous case of Matala Airport, where initial projections were 1 million passengers would show up. And when actually the airport went into operation, only 12 passengers showed up in 2017. So, very, very stark cases where big vanity projects went wrong, but they were all debt fueled. So this first issue of debt fueled infrastructure boom, particularly not generating a tradable surplus, appears to be a big policy mistake. Second is on some medium-term or even short-term fiscal choices. There were some major decisions made after the 2019 elections. VAT, the value-added tax rate, was reduced quite drastically from 15% to 8%. Threshold for VAT taxation was raised from about 12 million rupees to 300 million. Massive, almost a 28% increase. Corporate taxes were reduced from 28% to 24%. Lots of exemptions were introduced. And the personal taxes were also reduced from 24 to 18%. And the exemptions were increased from 5 lakh to 30 lakh. So this package of fiscal reforms perhaps would have yielded, in the West, we often see rates being reduced. And if that's accompanied by the base growing, you can even end up with a revenue increasing. But that needs the healthy transmission mechanisms to kick in. But if you're anticipating a crisis in a country where there's been a big debt buildup, these kind of fiscal choices don't often lead to desirable outcomes. And we saw in the case of Sri Lanka, revenue collapsing by almost 30% immediately. And the private rating agencies were taking notice, and the credit rating was downgraded, and that new flow of borrowing was actually effectively shut off. So you couldn't service old debts with new borrowing, something that many countries are adept at doing. Sri Lanka could no longer do that. And that coincided with the tourism bust, onset of COVID, and more recently the war, really placed Sri Lanka in a difficult situation. So the second policy issue was the fiscal story. The third, I'm sure folks have heard about this, the rapid and almost dramatic turn of the country towards organic farming, ban on chemical fertilizers, etc., often not relying on scientific advice within the country, but reliance on Buddhist monks and other very, very, very questionable advice. Some of these drastic policies, which is, again, what was the outcome? 25–30% plummeting in agricultural output quite rapidly. So the fiscal blunder, the agriculture production blunder, the debt-fueled infrastructure was then in response to that big void in fiscal revenue generation. The central bank responded with a lot of printing of money. And at the time, as colleagues in the room will recall, something called modern monetary theory was quite in vogue in the developed world, and you could actually print your way through crises of this nature. But that may have been a temporary luxury for countries that deal with hard currencies, that print the euro, that print the dollar, that print the Japanese yen. Countries that do not print convertible currencies, we don't actually have that kind of a luxury. And when you cross that disciplinary red line, it quickly leads to loss of confidence in the system. And this is what hit the remittance inflows, in fact. When you anticipate that exchange rates are going to change quite dramatically, that steady, predictable flow of remittance suddenly got diverted to informal channels. And this is what emptied the foreign currency coffers of Sri Lanka. And finally, the international adversity, which I've already alluded to. So these 5 issues really conspired, and they came together to effectively force Sri Lanka to default, something that it had never done before since 1948, and found itself in a very difficult situation. The other complexity there is the nature of creditors, right? You can see 5 distinct groups of creditors operating under quite different circumstances. First, you have the senior creditors, the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the International Monetary Fund. Senior creditors, they don't often restructure their debt, and it's something that you park aside. But they can also be dealt with in the sense that the country in question is often a member state of these international agencies, and one could possibly defer payments, etc. The second group of creditors that Sri Lanka has to deal with, and I assume this will be the case for Pakistan as well, is the Paris Club, which is the more established group of creditors, the rich world, the United States, Europe, Japan. They, on the positive side, they do have well-established methods and practices with which they go about refinancing or rescheduling or even forgiving debt. The third group of creditors, and this is complicating the situation in Sri Lanka, is the new creditors, which are sizable, China and India. Now, there's a geopolitical element there. The Paris Club is wary on how China will handle its debt stock. China is wary of how, especially the international sovereign bonds, who are largely Western-owned, will deal with the situation. And each is cautious that the money that the party may forgive is not being used to pay off the other. So that geopolitical element is really complicating the situation there. The fourth group of creditors are the international sovereign bonds. And in Sri Lanka's case, it's almost 40%, 38 to 40%. That actually, contrary to popular opinion, where a lot of the Chinese debt is often discussed, it's only 10%, the Chinese thing, but the ISPs is dominant, 40%. And the final are the domestic borrowers, right? So this dealing with these 5 separate groups of creditors will be very tricky. Now, the IMF mission, which the country was resisting to going to for almost 2 years, largely for, again, those internal, inward-looking, quite nationalistic regions, it was forced to reach out to the IMF. And as I'm speaking to you, the IMF mission has just arrived in Colombo. They will stay there for another 10 days, and they're trying to negotiate the EFF, the Extended Fund Facility, which hopefully will deal with some of the economic reforms, the urgent reforms, getting that fiscal story back on track, and giving and restoring some of that central bank autonomy, removing some of that political interference, restructuring of some of the state-owned enterprises, etc., will be very important, and that remains to be seen. The country is hopeful that an IMF package is forthcoming quite soon, but the IMF has to deem that the country's debt portfolio is sustainable before even it can lend a single penny, right? So that charter is very important for it. But in my own estimation, and from what I know of the country, it will take another 6 to 9 months before a credible IMF program is in place. There is something called the RFI, the Rapid Financing Instrument, that the country is mulling, but that was largely for the low-income countries. But there are some executive board members who have been lobbying for Sri Lanka to get that facility by using Ukraine as an example. So even though Sri Lanka is almost an upper middle income country, treat it like a low income country for now and get that rapid financing in place. But those are all discussions happening right now. Finally, let me conclude with this thought, not just on the Chinese debt, but also the Paris Club debt. A lot of the issue will be on what mode of debt restructuring or debt management will you go for? Is it debt renewal and refinancing? Pakistan, I think, has had some experience of this with China. There's the debt reprofiling and rescheduling. Angola and Zambia have gone through this. There's the whole experience of debt restructuring, where the actual terms of borrowing are adjusted. And we've seen this with Ethiopia vis-a-vis China, Kyrgyz Republic, etc. Laos has tried with some debt to equity swaps. And finally, the most generous of them all is debt forgiveness or debt cancellation, which is very rare to come by. We've seen this happen for special cases, especially with the Chinese credit in the case of Cuba and Venezuela. Both are special friends. Republic of Congo, strategic regions, but that is very hard to come by. So the Sri Lankan case remains complicated. And there's been a change in government. The Ranil Wickremesinghe is now back in power as both as Prime Minister and Finance Minister. There are mixed expectations from him on, given his experience as a sixth-term prime minister, he may just be able to pull it off, but he doesn't have his own political base. He's still reliant on the Rajapaksas for the support. So that introduces this very complicated nature of things. On the other hand, nobody else was stepping up. So we are in that very complex political economy world in Sri Lanka, but the lessons from there will set a precedence for how the other countries will also go about managing their debt distress. And Laos, Pakistan, in the case of Asia, but many in sub-Saharan Africa, against that backdrop of severe headwinds in the global economy. I think this is, we've just seen the beginning of the story unfold. So let me stop there. Thank you very much.